There's something magical about water. Whether it's the sound of waves crashing or just the sight of sunlight dancing on its surface, a body of water has this way of making everything feel peaceful. For years, one man had dreamed of owning a place where he could escape from the chaos of everyday life, a home with its own private lake. And finally, after working hard and saving every penny, that dream became a reality. This guy wasn't some big-shot millionaire. He was an ordinary person who loved nature and wanted a simple, happy life. He found the perfect spot tucked away in a quiet suburban area surrounded by hills and trees. It felt like stepping into another world, far removed from the noise and traffic of the city. At the heart of the property was a beautiful little lake, crystal clear and calm, almost like a mirror reflecting the sky above. The moment he signed the papers and got the keys to the house, he couldn't stop smiling. This wasn't just any home, it was his sanctuary. He imagined lazy mornings sipping coffee while watching the mist rise off the water, weekends spent fishing with friends, and evenings floating around on a kayak under the stars. But what really excited him most was the jet ski sitting in his garage. He'd bought it months ago, knowing exactly where it would come in handy once he moved in. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. He spent hours exploring every corner of his new property, marveling at how lucky he was to have all this space to himself. Neighbors introduced themselves over friendly waves across fences, and everyone seemed nice enough, at least on the surface. Things were going so well that he never saw the storm brewing just out of sight. You see, living in a neighborhood often means dealing with rules set by a group called the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. These groups are supposed to keep communities looking nice and running smoothly, but sometimes they can get carried away. In this case, the HOA started taking notice of the new neighbor with the private lake. They didn't say anything outright at first, but whispers began spreading among the residents. Some people complained about the noise coming from the lake whenever the jet ski roared to life. Others griped that having such a large body of water nearby made the neighborhood look too flashy or out of place. A few even muttered that the lake should belong to everyone, not just one person. None of these complaints reached him directly, though. Instead, they stayed hidden behind closed doors, growing louder with each passing day. But our guy? He had no clue. To him, the lake was part of his land, the same as the grassy yard or the driveway leading up to his front door. Why wouldn't he use it however he pleased? After all, he'd worked so hard to afford this slice of paradise. So when weekends rolled around, he fired up the jet ski, inviting friends over to share in the fun. Laughter rang out across the water, blending with the hum of the engine and the occasional splash as someone jumped off the dock. It was during one of these carefree afternoons that things took a turn. Unbeknownst to him, someone from the HOA had been keeping tabs on his activities. What started as harmless gossip soon escalated into something more serious. Someone decided it wasn't enough to talk behind his back. They wanted action. And that's when the trouble truly began. Little did he know, his peaceful retreat was about to become the center of attention in ways he never expected. All because of a few phone calls, some misplaced anger, and a misunderstanding that would force him to. The day started like any other weekend. The sun was shining bright, the birds were chirping, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. It was one of those perfect mornings that made you want to grab life by the horns and enjoy every second of it. Our guy woke up early, feeling the kind of energy that only comes when you've got plans to do something fun. Today was jet ski day, his favorite way to spend time on the lake. He walked down to the dock, the wooden planks creaking softly under his feet as he went. The water looked inviting, smooth as glass and sparkling in the sunlight. He couldn't help but smile as he fired up the jet ski. There's just something about the sound of the engine revving to life. It feels powerful, freeing, like nothing else matters except the open water ahead of you. With a quick glance around to make sure everything was clear, he hopped on and sped off across the lake. For the next hour or so, he zipped back and forth, carving through the water like it was butter. Every now and then, he'd slow down near the middle of the lake to take in the view, the trees lining the shore, the gentle breeze ruffling the surface of the water. Life felt good, really good. He even stopped for a moment to snap a few pictures, with his phone thinking about how lucky he was to have this place all to himself. But then something caught his eye. At first he thought maybe it was just a car driving by on the road nearby. But no, it wasn't that. As he turned toward the edge of his property, he saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the trees. His stomach dropped. What on earth was going on? Confused and more than a little irritated, he cut the engine and paddled back to shore. Sure enough, 2 police officers were standing there waiting for him. One of them stepped forward as he climbed off the jet ski, dripping, wet and still holding his helmet. "Sir," the officer said, "we received a complaint about noise coming from this area. Can we talk to you for a moment?" Noise. Seriously, that's what this was about? He stared at them, dumbfounded. "This is my lake," he said, pointing. Behind him. "I'm not disturbing anyone, no one else is here." The officers exchanged a look but didn't say anything right away. Finally, one of them spoke up. "We understand that, sir, but someone reported reckless behavior and excessive noise. We're required to investigate these kinds of complaints." Reckless behavior? Excessive noise? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was ridiculous. "Look," he said, trying to stay calm. "This is private property. I paid for this land, including the lake. How am I being reckless if I'm just using my own stuff?" The officers nodded sympathetically, but they weren't budging. They explained that they had to follow protocol and document the situation. So, reluctantly, he answered their questions, explaining over and over again that the lake belonged to him, and that he hadn't done anything wrong. Still, they insisted on filing a report before leaving. As he watched their patrol car disappear down the driveway, he felt a mix of anger and disbelief bubbling inside him. Who would call the cops on him for riding a jet ski on his own lake? It didn't make sense. Was this some kind of prank? Or was someone out to get him? It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. He didn't need a detective to figure out who was behind this. The HOA. Of course it was them. Ever since he'd moved in, he'd noticed the sideways glances and the hushed conversations whenever he passed by. He knew not everyone in the neighborhood was thrilled about his private lake. Some people probably thought it was unfair that he got to have something they didn't. But calling the cops? That seemed extreme, even for the HOA. Fuming, he paced, back and forth along the shoreline, replaying the whole thing in his head. How dare they treat him like some troublemaker? He hadn't broken any laws. If anything, they were the ones causing problems. But sitting there stewing wasn't going to solve anything. He needed proof, solid evidence that the lake was 100% his property. And he needed it fast. That evening, he sat down at his kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers. He pulled out the thick folder containing all the documents related to his home purchase. Somewhere in there had to be the deed, the official record showing exactly what he owned. After flipping through page after page, he finally found it. There it was, written in black and white. The lake was part of his property, not the HOA's, not the neighbors. His. Just reading those words gave him a small sense of relief, but he knew he couldn't stop there. If he wanted to put an end to this nonsense once and for all, he'd need backup. So he picked up the phone and called a real estate attorney. Explaining the situation, he asked if the deed alone would be enough to shut down the HOA's claims. The attorney assured him it was rock-solid proof, but suggested sending certified copies to both the HOA and the police department to avoid any future misunderstandings. Feeling a bit more confident, he drafted a letter to go along with the documents. In it, he laid out the facts clearly and firmly, reminding everyone that the lake was legally his and warning them against making any further attempts to interfere. Once everything was ready, he sent it off and waited. Days passed, and though he tried to focus on other things, the incident weighed heavily on his mind. Would the HOA back off, or would they try to push the issue further? Either way, he knew he was prepared to fight for what was rightfully his. This wasn't just about a jet ski or a lake. It was about standing up for himself and refusing to let others dictate how he lived his life. The days following the police visit felt like a roller coaster of emotions. On one hand, he was confident that the deed to his property would settle everything once and for all. But on the other hand, there was this nagging uncertainty. What if the HOA didn't back down? What if they tried to twist things or find loopholes? He knew he had the law on his side, but dealing with people who were determined to make trouble wasn't always straightforward. He spent hours going over the deed again and again, reading every word carefully, making sure he understood exactly what it said. It was clear as day. The lake was part of his land. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The boundaries were marked, the ownership undisputed. Still, just having the document wasn't enough. He needed someone who could explain it in legal terms, someone whose word carried weight. That's why he reached out to a real estate attorney. When he met with the attorney, he brought along not only the deed, but also copies of emails and notes from conversations where neighbors had hinted at their dissatisfaction. The attorney listened, patiently, nodding along as he laid out the situation. By the end of the meeting, the attorney reassured him that the HOA had no leg to stand on. "This is your property," the attorney said firmly. "They can complain all they want, but unless they have concrete evidence proving otherwise, and they don't, they're wasting their time." With that vote of confidence, he decided to take action. He gathered certified copies of the deed and drafted a detailed letter addressed to both the HOA board and the local police department. In the letter, he explained the situation calmly, but firmly. He included specific excerpts from the deed highlighting his ownership of the lake and emphasized that he had every right to use it however he pleased, as long as he stayed within the law, which he absolutely was. He ended the letter with a warning. Any further attempts to harass him or interfere with his activities would result in legal consequences. Sending off the documents felt like tossing a stone into a pond. You never know how big the ripples will be. At first, nothing happened. Days went by and life returned to normal. He started using the jet ski again, though he kept an ear out for sirens just in case. Neighbors waved hello like usual, and everything seemed quiet, too quiet. Then came the summons. It arrived in the mail one morning, tucked inside a plain white envelope. His heart sank as he read the notice. An emergency HOA meeting had been called, and he was required to attend. The timing couldn't have been worse. He'd been looking forward to a relaxing weekend on the lake, but ignoring the summons wasn't an option. If anything, this was his chance to face them head-on and put an end to the drama once and for all. The day of the meeting arrived, and he walked into the conference room feeling a mix of nerves and determination. He carried a folder stuffed with copies of the deed, letters from the attorney, and even a map showing the exact boundaries of his property. As he took a seat at the table, he noticed the tension in the air. Some members avoided eye contact while others glared openly. Clearly, this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. The meeting began with the HOA president, a stern-looking man with thin glasses and a clipboard, reading off the agenda. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood up, cleared his throat, and got straight to the point. "I'm here because there's been some confusion about my property," he said, holding up the deed. "This document proves beyond any doubt that the lake is mine. I bought it, I pay taxes on it, and I have every legal right to use it however I choose." He went on to explain how the HOA's complaints were baseless and rooted in misunderstanding, or, worse, jealousy. He pointed out that none of the noise complaints held water, pun unintended, since the lake was entirely on his land, and far enough from neighboring homes to avoid causing disturbances. He even offered to show them aerial photos of the property to prove just how isolated the lake was. As he spoke, he could see the reactions shifting around the room. Some board members looked embarrassed, realizing they might have jumped the gun. Others seemed defiant, unwilling to admit they were wrong. One particularly vocal neighbor, a woman who lived 2 houses down, spoke up, accusing him of being selfish. "You've got this beautiful lake," she said sharply. "Why shouldn't the rest of us get to enjoy it too?" Her comment caught him off guard, but only for a moment. Taking a deep breath, he responded calmly. "Because I paid for it," he said. "If you want a lake, maybe you should buy your own." The room fell silent. It was a bold statement, but it was true. He wasn't about to let anyone guilt-trip him into giving up something he'd worked so hard for. After what felt like an eternity, the HOA president reluctantly acknowledged that their case against him was weak at best. They agreed to drop the matter for now, but not without issuing a vague warning about keeping the noise levels down. He nodded politely, knowing full well they had no real power to enforce such a rule on his private property. Walking out of the meeting, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't just about winning the argument. It was about standing up for himself and refusing to let bullies dictate his life. Sure, there might still be whispers and lingering resentment among certain neighbors, but he didn't care anymore. He had the law on his side, and that was all that mattered. Back home, he stood by the edge of the lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The water shimmered in shades of orange and pink, peaceful and undisturbed. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly at ease. This place was his sanctuary, and no amount of drama was going to change that. The HOA meeting had been a tense showdown, but it was finally over. As he walked out of the conference room, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, pride, and even a bit of frustration. Relief, because the HOA had backed off, at least officially. Pride, because he'd stood his ground and proven his point. And frustration, because despite everything, some people still didn't seem willing to let go of their grudges. He climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he replayed the meeting in his mind. The accusations, the glares, the thinly veiled threats, it all felt so unnecessary. All he'd wanted was to enjoy his property in peace. Why did some people have to make things so complicated? Shaking his head, he started the engine and drove home, eager to leave the drama behind him. When he got back to the house, he headed straight for the lake. Something about being near the water always helped him clear his head. He sat on the dock, letting the cool breeze brush against his face as he stared out at the calm surface of the lake. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful place could become the center of so much conflict. But here he was, caught in the middle of it all. Over the next few days, life seemed to return to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after, something like this. Neighbors who had previously been friendly now gave him polite nods or avoided eye contact altogether. A couple of them muttered under their breath when they thought he wasn't listening, but most kept their distance. Word had spread quickly about what happened at the HOA meeting, and while some people respected his stance, others clearly resented him for standing up to the board. Still, he tried not to let it bother him. He reminded himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, if anything, they were the ones behaving badly. They'd called the cops on him, dragged him into a pointless meeting, and accused him of things that weren't true. All because they didn't like that he had something they didn't. That kind of pettiness wasn't worth losing sleep over. One afternoon, as he was tinkering with the jet ski in the garage, a neighbor stopped by unexpectedly. It was an older man who lived a few houses down, someone he'd exchanged pleasantries with occasionally but never really gotten to know. The man introduced himself again, just to be polite, and then got straight to the point. "Look," the neighbor said, shifting uncomfortably, "I just wanted to say I think you're handling this whole thing pretty well. Some folks around here are, well, let's just say they don't always play fair, but you've got every right to do what you're doing." It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. For the first time since the whole mess began, he felt like maybe not everyone in the neighborhood hated him. Maybe some people understood that he was just trying to live his life without causing trouble. He thanked the man sincerely, and they chatted for a few more minutes before parting ways. That brief conversation lifted his spirits, reminding him that not all conflicts end with winners and losers. Sometimes there's room for understanding, even in situations where tensions run high. Still, he knew better than to expect everyone to come around. There would always be those who held on to their bitterness no matter what. And honestly, he was okay with that. He couldn't control how other people felt. All he could do was focus on living his best life. With that mindset, he decided to embrace the peace and quiet of his property once again. Over the weekend, he invited a few close friends over for a barbecue by the lake. It was exactly what he needed. A chance to reconnect with people who mattered and remind himself why he'd bought this place in the first place. Together, they grilled burgers, told stories, and laughed until their sides hurt. Someone brought a portable speaker and soon music filled the air, blending with the sounds of nature. At one point during the evening, he found himself sitting, alone on the edge of the dock watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues. One of his friends joined him, plopping down beside him with a beer in hand. "You know," the friend said, "you handled that HOA thing like a pro. Most people would have cracked under that kind of pressure." He chuckled softly, taking a sip from his own drink. "Honestly, I didn't feel like I had much of a choice. Either I stood my ground or let them walk all over me, and I'm not about to let anyone take what's mine." His friend nodded thoughtfully. "Good call. People can be jerks sometimes, but you've got to stick up for yourself. Otherwise, they'll just keep pushing." They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the view and the company. It was moments like these that made everything else, the arguments, the stress, the endless back and forth, feel worth it. This was his home, his sanctuary, and no amount of drama was going to change that. As the night wore on, the group moved, closer to the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and sharing old stories. Laughter echoed across the water, carrying with it a sense of joy and camaraderie. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly happy. This was what life was supposed to be about, spending time with loved ones, creating memories, and appreciating the simple pleasures. By the time his friends left late that night, he was exhausted but content. He locked up the house, checked on the jet ski one last time, and headed to bed. As he lay there in the darkness, listening to the faint hum of crickets, outside he realized something important. The HOA might have tried to ruin his peace, but they hadn't succeeded. If anything, the whole ordeal had made him appreciate his home even more. The next morning, he woke up early and went for a walk along the shore. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden ripples across the lake. He paused for a moment, taking it all in, the beauty, the tranquility, the sheer perfection of it all. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he could handle them. After all, he'd already faced one of the toughest battles and come out stronger on the other side. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons when you least expect them. For the man with the private lake, the whole ordeal with the HOA had been one of those unexpected teachers. It wasn't just about proving ownership or standing up for his rights. It was about learning to navigate relationships, handle conflict, and find peace in the middle of chaos. By the time things settled down, he realized that while the battle might have ended, the experience had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. In the weeks following the HOA meeting, the neighborhood seemed quieter, almost too quiet. Some neighbors continued to give him cold shoulders, avoiding eye contact whenever their paths crossed. Others, however, began warming up again, offering polite smiles or casual waves as if nothing had happened. He didn't hold any grudges against those who were still upset. After all, people are entitled to their feelings. What mattered most was that he'd done everything right. He'd followed the law, respected his property lines, and refused to let anyone bully him into giving up what was rightfully his. To his surprise, a few neighbors even started reaching out, not to argue or complain, but to ask questions. One afternoon, a young couple who lived across the street knocked on his door. They looked nervous at first, shuffling their feet as they explained why they were there. "We've been thinking," the husband said hesitantly, "and we wanted to ask, how did you know so much about your property, like the deed and all that stuff?" He couldn't help but smile. Here they were, the same people who had likely sided with the HOA during the dispute, now asking for advice. Instead of brushing them off, he invited them inside and pulled out the folder containing his deed and other documents. Over coffee, he walked them through the process of understanding property boundaries, explaining how important it was to double-check legal paperwork before buying a home. The couple listened intently, nodding along as they scribbled notes. When they left, they thanked him sincerely, promising to look into their own property records more carefully. It was moments like these that reminded him why it was worth staying calm and patient, even when others weren't. Not everyone was out to get him. Some people simply didn't understand the situation. By sharing his knowledge and experiences, he could turn a negative experience into something positive, not just for himself, but for others too. As the months passed, he found new ways to enjoy his slice of paradise without stirring up trouble. He started hosting smaller gatherings by the lake, inviting only close friends and family members who truly appreciated the beauty of the place. There were bonfires under starlit skies, lazy afternoons spent fishing, and quiet mornings sipping coffee while watching the mist rise off the water. Each moment felt like a reminder of why he'd worked so hard to buy this property in the first place. One weekend, he decided to teach his nephew how to fish. The boy, no older than 10, had never held a fishing rod before, but he was eager to learn. Together, they set up near the edge of the lake, casting their lines into the still water. At first, the boy grew restless, constantly checking to see if anything had bitten, but as the hours ticked by, he began to relax, soaking in the peacefulness of the surroundings. Eventually, he reeled in his very first catch, a small bass that wriggled furiously in the net. His face lit up with excitement, and he turned to his uncle, beaming. "This is awesome," he exclaimed. "Can we come back next weekend?" Moments like these made every challenge worthwhile. Sure, there had been stress and frustration along the way, but none of that mattered when he saw the joy on his nephew's face. This was what life was supposed to be about, spending time with loved ones, creating memories, and appreciating the simple pleasures. The lake wasn't just a body of water. It was a place where happiness thrived, where laughter echoed, and where bonds grew stronger. Of course, not everything disappeared overnight. A handful of neighbors remained bitter, occasionally muttering complaints about the jet ski or the exclusive nature of his lake. But instead of letting it bother him, he chose to rise above it. He kept the noise levels reasonable, avoided using the jet ski late at night, and generally tried to be considerate of those around him. After all, living in a community meant finding a balance between personal freedom and mutual respect. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He'd already won the fight. By summer's end, the neighborhood seemed to settle into a rhythm. People stopped talking about the lake drama, focusing instead on their own lives. Kids played outside, dogs barked in the distance, and life went on as usual. Even the HOA board seemed less confrontational, perhaps realizing that picking fights over trivial matters wasn't worth the effort. Though tensions lingered beneath the surface, they faded into the background, overshadowed by the passage of time. On one particularly beautiful evening, he stood on the dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky blazed with shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the glassy surface of the lake. He thought about everything that had happened, the arguments, the stress, the victories, and realized that it had all led him here, to this moment of pure contentment. He had fought for his rights, defended his home, and come out stronger on the other side. Now all he wanted was to savor the peace he'd worked so hard to protect. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, he fired up the jet ski one last time that day. With the engine humming softly, he skimmed across the water, feeling the cool breeze against his skin. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely free, free from doubt, free from anger, free from the weight of other people's expectations. This was his sanctuary, his dream come true, and nothing could take that away from him. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for himself, navigating conflicts, and finding joy even in the face of adversity. And as he sped across the lake under the vast night sky, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them head-on, with courage, determination, and an unshakable belief in himself. Because sometimes, life throws curveballs, but when you stand firm and fight for what's yours, the reward is sweeter than you ever imagined.